Welcome to this episode of the Lost Messages Show. There's an old Chinese saying, hard work leads to wealth. We've all heard this since we were young. Endure hardship to become a person of status. Parents, teachers, and even leaders have all told us this. However, this saying might have held true in an agrarian society. For instance, if you plowed an extra acre of land or raised a couple more pigs, you could indeed save more for your family. But in today's technology-driven era, if hard work truly led to wealth, then the laborers in China who struggle to make ends meet, who rise before dawn, toil through the day, and face wind and rain, would all be wealthy. There was a short film in China that was taken down, featuring migrant workers who start their day at 4 a.m. and can't even afford 300 yuan for Social Security. These people are 100 times more hardworking than white-collar workers who sit in air-conditioned offices. But have they made money? So, the notion that Chinese people can endure hardship and toil is not a virtue, but a result of the harsh conditions in ancient China. They had to endure hardship just to survive, not because they chose to, but because they had no other choice. There's a saying online that really hits home. The more you can endure hardship, the more hardship you'll face. When enduring hardship becomes a praised quality, you might be taken advantage of and exploited. The more you can tolerate, the more they'll demand. However, if you look at today's office buildings and tech parks, you might find that the old adage about the value of hard work hasn't completely disappeared. He merely changed the packaging. Instead of facing the earth and sky, people now stare at screens. Even white-collar workers have become like draft animals. Previously they tilled the fields. Now, they type on keyboards. What was supposed to be a 9-to-5 job has turned into a 9-9-6 schedule, along with the so-called wolf culture. Some attribute the emergence of these terms to capitalism, where capitalists exploit employees to the extreme, aligning with Marxist critiques of exploitation. However, let's not forget that Wall Street bankers worth millions also work for hours on end without sleep for bonuses. Similarly, top programmers in Silicon Valley, earning millions annually, often sleep at the office to beat competitors to market. They, too, are tired and striving. The question is, why in China does this overwork become a culture of intense obedience and active sacrifice, labeled as wolf culture? Why do bosses in China so brazenly frame overtime as loyalty to the company, contribution to the nation, and personal responsibility? Wall Street employees work for bonuses, and Silicon Valley workers toil for stock options and equity. Essentially, they choose to do so. This is entirely different from the treatment of employees as grass in China. For decades, we've been accustomed to comparing Chinese companies with Western ones, using a purely capitalist framework to understand China. However, if we shift our perspective, we might realize that Chinese companies' rivals are not merely fair market competitors. Behind every decision and every push forward lies a more powerful force driving them. Thus, employees in China, whether white-collar or manual laborers, have all become mere grass, to be harvested by those in power. The root cause lies in the fact that China's economy, on the surface, can be seen as a form of party-state capitalism. It blurs the lines between state-owned and private capital. The authority of the party and the state is not only embedded in corporate governance reforms, but also deeply integrated into every aspect of enterprise operations through political loyalty requirements imposed on all economic participants. Many of us may not have considered this, whether it's state-owned enterprises with national branding or private giants like Huawei, Alibaba, and Tencent. Chinese enterprises, to varying degrees, serve as the peripheral nerves of the party-state strategy. If we envision the nation as a vast organic entity, it has a brain that sets the strategy, for example, determining which technological sectors must achieve self-sufficiency and independence, as Xi Jinping has emphasized too. Avoid being controlled by the West. The various enterprises, large and small, are like nerve endings spread throughout the body. Their role is to receive signals from the brain and translate national strategic intentions into specific market actions. In other words, the immense pressure you feel while working in an office may seem to come from your boss's mood, your KPIs, or the fierce competition within your industry. However, beneath these pressures lies an additional layer unique to many capitalist, free and democratic societies, a collective competitive pressure transmitted from the national level through the enterprise channel imbued with a sense of existential crisis. If we attribute the 996 work culture solely to the greed of capitalists, we're oversimplifying the issue. No culture emerges out of thin air. To understand the current wolf culture and internal competition within Chinese enterprises, we must trace it back to its spiritual roots. This mindset has been shaped over the past 2 centuries by a mix of humiliation, anxiety, and an intense desire for success. China's modern history has been overshadowed by humiliation, starting from the decline of the Qing dynasty. Sayings like "fall behind" and "get beaten" and "a weak country has no diplomacy" have lingered in the collective consciousness. From the self-strengthening movement's large-scale construction projects to later efforts by private enterprises to save the nation through industry, and then to the post-1949 rush towards industrialization, the goal has been to cover the ground of Western development in the shortest time possible. In this context, efficiency and speed were never just business choices, they were political decisions about survival. Scholars have compared China with other East Asian countries like Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, finding that Chinese state capitalism has a unique characteristic: the state has a paternalistic tendency to control capital, and private property protection is relatively weak. This paternalistic control can be traced back to the Qing dynasty. In ancient Chinese tradition, commerce and capital were never independent of political power, they were naturally subservient to the state's grand narrative. This underlying logic has remained unchanged for centuries, whether during the Republican era under the Nationalists or the subsequent People's Republic. Then, with the advent of the Reform and opening up era Daiwang, when China first opened its doors, the country's pioneering entrepreneurs encountered a stark and daunting reality. While they were still operating factories in Shenzhen, watching black and white televisions, Japanese brands like Sony were already dominating the global market with their portable televisions. As domestic cars remained a rarity, accessible only to a few leaders, Ford and Toyota had already become household names worldwide. This vast technological gap laid the foundation for China's intense, competitive wolf culture and unfair business practices. The concept of wolf culture was first popularized by Hawaii's founder, Ren Zhengfei. He identified 3 key traits of wolves that businesses should emulate: keen senses to seize opportunities, collective hunting to ensure survival, and relentless perseverance. Ren introduced this philosophy to help Hawaii compete against international giants like Ericsson, Nokia, and Siemens in the telecommunications market. To secure orders, Hawaii employees would drink with clients until they were incapacitated. To acquire technology, they would disassemble foreign machinery and reverse engineer it. To capture market share, they would engage in brutal price wars, driving competitors to the brink of collapse. This unyielding pursuit had its merits. It allowed China to establish itself as the world's factory in just 30 years. However, it also ingrained a mindset that prioritized outcomes over rules, results over processes, and survival above all else. A mentality where the winner takes all, and the loser is condemned. Within this grand narrative, individual dignity, rights, and respect for international order and rules are often considered secondary. When discussing the concept of Naiwan or involution, it originates from the English term, involution. This term is ubiquitous on Chinese internet platforms, but many are unaware of its academic origins. In 1963, the American anthropologist Clifford Geertz introduced the concept of agricultural involution while studying agriculture in Indonesia's Java island. He observed that local farmers, despite increasing their labor input, such as more people or longer hours and more meticulous cultivation, did not see a corresponding increase in output. This resulted in a form of growth without development, where people became busier, but their lives did not improve. Later, the historian Huang Zhongji applied this concept to China, adding a crucial dimension: diminishing returns on labor. This means that the more one works, the less return one sees for each additional hour. This scenario resonates with the plight of many Chinese workers today. The anthropologist, Shang Biao, offers a precise description. Consider employees subjected to a 996 work schedule. They face elimination if they do not work overtime. Yet even with overtime, they may see no path forward. The cycle of overtime intensifies, and stopping is not an option, as doing so would be disastrous. Consequently, China sees numerous cases of overwork-related deaths, which not only cause personal anxiety, but also reflect a structural predicament. This root cause lies in the historical momentum of catching up and the sustained pressure of national strategy. This anxiety also provided a perfect entry point for the subsequent infusion of national will. If we consider the historical mindset of catching up as the base operating system, then the massive state-owned enterprise system that currently dominates China's economy is the core element operating on this system. What are state-owned enterprises? They exist in Western societies as well, but they primarily handle public utilities such as water, electricity, gas, and railways. Their goal is simple: to provide stable public services and avoid significant losses. However, in China, the situation is entirely different. Chinese state-owned enterprises are referred to as the eldest sons of the Republic. The name itself indicates that these are not commercial companies but direct executors of national will and pillars of the party state system. The scale difference between state-owned enterprises and private enterprises is staggering. A think tank once reported that state-owned enterprises in Japan account for only 1.4% of GDP. In countries like South Korea and Taiwan, which have latecomer advantages, the proportion is relatively higher, but still does not exceed 10%. In former Eastern European countries that were part of the Soviet Socialist bloc, the share of state-owned enterprises has generally been reduced to below 20%. However, in China, this proportion is significantly higher. The State-Owned Assets Supervision and Administration Commission, SASAC, is the supermanager, controlling the lifeblood of all key industries imaginable, from energy and communications to finance, transportation, and military industry. The top executives of these central enterprises, from chairmen to general managers, have their appointments managed by the Central Organization Department. These individuals hold ranks equivalent to vice-ministerial, or even ministerial-level government officials. During the era of Xi Jinping, some observers have noted that the role of party-state capitalism in the economy has not diminished, but has instead been strengthened. This highlights a fundamental logical difference between Western enterprises and Chinese state-owned enterprises, society. Western enterprises prioritize efficiency, seeking to maximize profits with minimal costs. In contrast, Chinese SOEs often prioritize effectiveness, pursuing strategic goals at any cost. Numerous studies have shown that Chinese OSOs generally underperform in financial performance and innovation compared to private enterprises. However, this does not concern them, as their purpose is not to generate profits but to execute the will of the party state. A clear example is the Belt and Road Initiative, where numerous state-owned construction companies and banks responded to the government's call to build infrastructure abroad, such as railways, ports, and power plants. The Xi Jinping government has used the Belt and Road Initiative to stimulate the global expansion of these SOEs. It has also continuously invested in and subsidized strategic industries like advanced manufacturing, AI, new energy, and high-speed rail. Many of these projects are unprofitable from a purely commercial standpoint and have extremely long payback periods. However, this does not deter them, as their primary goal is not financial return, but to open up new geopolitical spaces for the nation. This political logic, rather than an economic one, was evident from the outset of the Belt and Road Initiative. However, this political logic seems to have largely failed today. Another example is the semiconductor industry in Made in China 2025. Upon its launch, the State Investment Fund began investing heavily. State-owned enterprises are pouring massive investments into the semiconductor industry, despite facing extremely high failure rates. However, their goal isn't to find the next unicorn. Instead, they aim to build a complete industrial chain with the country's collective effort to avoid being held hostage by foreign technologies. Such pressure inevitably trickles down to employees. State-owned enterprise employees sent to underdeveloped regions in Africa aren't there to expand the market, but to fulfill certain political objectives. Similarly, engineers at companies like BYD work tirelessly, not just to overcome technical challenges, but to ensure national security. In this system, personal interests and work-life balance must take a backseat to the national agenda. Having a broader perspective means clearing the path for patriotism. Your overtime is a contribution, and your obedience is discipline. Unions merely assist companies in completing tasks and won't advocate for your rights against management. State-owned enterprises have set the tone for China's corporate culture, emphasizing that individual efforts should align with grand narratives, and that national goals should supersede personal development. Private enterprises that emerged later also grew within this environment. Some might argue that state-owned enterprises are clear, as they are supported by the state, but what about companies like Huawei, Alibaba, and Tencent, which compete in the market as private enterprises? Surprisingly, the opposite is true. There's an insightful academic perspective that state-owned enterprises are the party's business units, while private enterprises are the party's joint ventures. So how does the Communist Party gradually infiltrate the private sector? The first step is establishing party branches. In 2002, fewer than 27% of private enterprises had a party organization. However, by 2017, this figure had surged to nearly 3/4. By 2021, the largest 500 private enterprises in China had achieved full coverage of party organizations, meaning every single one had a party organization as the highest leadership layer. The second step is amending charters. Between 2015 and 2018, over 180 large private enterprises revised their company charters to explicitly include the role of the party organization in corporate governance. The third step is deploying party officials. In 2019, the Hangzhou municipal government sent government officials to reside in 100 key private enterprises, including Alibaba and Geely. In 2023, the Shaanxi Provincial Party Committee Organization Department dispatched officials as first secretaries to 25 key enterprises. These officials were not commercial consultants invited by the enterprises, but were instead sent by the party organization. The fourth step is capital binding. From 2000 to 2019, the proportion of private enterprises that received state-owned enterprise investments or were highly dependent on state-owned capital more than doubled, reaching 35% of all registered capital. Today, state-invested enterprises account for nearly half of China's private assets. At this point, it becomes clear that China's private enterprises are not purely the product of a market economy. According to a June 25 announcement from the Communist Party of China's Central Committee Organization Department, by the end of 2024, the total number of Communist Party members in China will exceed 1 billion. There will be 5.25 million grassroots organizations, with 1.6 million of these party organizations operating within enterprises. Here's the refined text. We will now examine specific cases, such as Huawei's implementation of its wolf culture. Is this merely due to Ren Zhengfei's personal preferences and style? Clearly not. Huawei's rise coincides with China's transition from a communication powerhouse to a communication superpower during the Tog and Threg eras. At that time, the Chinese communication market was dominated by foreign companies like Ericsson, Nokia, and Siemens, which charged exorbitant prices for equipment. Additionally, China realized that its national information infrastructure was built on foreign technology, which was unacceptable from a national security and strategic standpoint. Therefore, Huawei was tasked with a mission beyond mere commerce, breaking Western monopolies and achieving communication independence. To do so, Huawei had to be cheaper, faster, and more relentless than its competitors. Overseas Huawei employees were often the first to arrive at client sites, and the last to leave. In research and development, they invested obsessively to catch up and eventually surpass competitors by the 5G era. This extreme dedication was packaged as a corporate culture that prioritizes strugglers. Employees were even encouraged to sign struggler agreements, voluntarily forgoing some vacation time in exchange for higher salaries and equity. While Westerners might find this bewildering, under the grand strategy of securing technological heights for the nation, such behavior was justified. Later, when the United States imposed comprehensive sanctions on Huawei, this culture was further reinforced, fostering a united front against external adversity. I recall that when I first started the Prince video series, I mentioned that even as a private enterprise, Huawei had become a crucial part of China's national strategy. Western countries had no choice but to sanction Huawei. Therefore, it is misguided to feel innocent. Now, let's consider another case. The world's largest electric vehicle battery manufacturer, Contemporary Amperex Technology Company Limited, CATL, secured approximately 2.85 billion yuan, or over $390 million USD, in government subsidies in just the first half of 2023. This figure represents only half a year's worth of subsidies and does not include the various policy advantages and joint ventures with other state-owned enterprises. Given this, can one truly consider CATL a purely market-driven private enterprise? Now, even former U.S. President Donald Trump is following suit, with the U.S. government directly investing in key sectors. Meanwhile, Chinese enterprises have paid a heavy price for their high-pressure operations over the years, often measured in human lives. On the morning of December 29, 2020, a 22-year-old female employee of Pinduoduo suddenly collapsed and died on her way home from work. In her final WeChat message, she wrote, "Dedicate my youth to Pinduoduo." After the incident gained public attention, Xinhua news agency conducted an in-depth investigation, revealing shocking findings. Employees at Pinduoduo's Shanghai headquarters were required to work 300 hours per month, while those in the promotions department faced an even higher demand of 380 hours. One former employee, who had been with the company for a year and a half, described working from 11 a.m. to 11 p.m., 6 days a week. Failure to meet these work hour requirements resulted in meetings with supervisors. However, these demands were not officially documented but rather an unwritten rule, an invisible system that is difficult to prove. In a bitter twist after the incident, Pinduoduo's official account on Jihu responded with, "Look at the common people at the bottom, who aren't all trading their lives for money." They later deleted this statement, acknowledging its inappropriateness. Despite the screenshots spreading across the entire internet, similar tragedies continued to occur in 2024. A 36-year-old employee of Biden Oyan suddenly died in his rented apartment. Family members retrieved his check-in records from his phone, revealing that he had worked approximately 12 hours a day for 26 days the previous month. According to China's labor law, overtime work should not exceed 36 hours per month. This individual's monthly overtime was several times the legal limit. China's National Bureau of Statistics published a report in July 2024, confirming that this was not an isolated incident. In June of that year, the national average working hours reached 48.6 hours, nearly 3 hours more than the same period in 2019. This means that on average, Chinese workers are consistently exceeding the standard of 48 hours per week. Therefore, the 996 work schedule is just the surface issue. The core problem lies with these private enterprises which, in fact, have taken on some of the functions of state-owned enterprises. They must compete on the global stage to secure victories for the nation, break through blockades in key positions, and generate foreign exchange through market success. Consequently, the wolf culture effectively organizes employees, binding their personal futures with the company's survival, and even the nation's destiny. Returning to the initial question, is China's enterprise culture an extreme version of capitalism? My answer is clear: no. If we compare Western capitalist enterprises to boxers in a ring, we can see that their rules are well defined. There are referees, ropes, and rounds, and scores are tallied after the match. Chinese enterprises are akin to chess pieces on a board, where the competition is ruthless, and the survival of one means the demise of another. Alternatively, they can be likened to puppets controlled by strings, serving the grand strategy of the nation. These enterprises can be sacrificed at any moment to fulfill the state's objectives. Therefore, the concept of state capitalism, or what was previously termed the Beijing Consensus, presents a unique perspective. China's economy, much like the rest of the world, is driven by corporate entities. However, the distinctive feature of Chinese state capitalism is that it represents a unique variation of corporate capitalism, where the state's will permeates every aspect, and the market must align with the nation's purported higher interests. This clarifies why the 996 work culture, often labeled as a product of capitalism, is a misinterpretation. It is a novel hybrid, combining the brutality of market competition, the anxiety to surpass others, and the mobilizing power of a nation-state. This structure is deeply integrated, blurring the lines between corporate and national boundaries, with mutual penetration. Understanding this context helps explain why young people and workers in China endure so much hardship. As the benefits of rapid economic development wane and the pressure of national strategy intensifies, individuals feel increasingly squeezed. More young people are beginning to question the purpose of their relentless struggle, leading to the emergence of the lying flat phenomenon in recent years. Western scholars define this trend among Chinese youth as the conscious and brave resistance against oppressive and high-demand societies, directly challenges the state's narrative of the Chinese dream, or the labor is beautiful, Pua brainwashing system. Some argue that lying flat is a passive rebellion against China's diligent culture and the entrepreneurial spirit advocated by neoliberalism, or a form of nonviolent non-cooperation. No wonder many young Chinese people are turning to Buddhism and Taoism. In the past 2 years, the Central Economic Work Conference has begun to propose the idea of breaking away from involutionary development. Companies like Jiǔcài, Midea, Hire, and Miniso have all announced mandatory early closure policies, sparking a wave of anti-involution fervor. According to Sina Finance, the headquarters of Jiǔcài in Shenzhen starts clearing out at 8:30 p.m., with managers and HR conducting 3 rounds of evacuation, and by 9 p.m., most employees have left. Midea also implemented a 6:20 p.m. clearance policy. The State Administration for Market Regulation even held a symposium, inviting local enterprises like Alibaba and JD.com, and labeled excessive overtime as a distortion of market order. However, I understand that when something seems too good to be true, there's usually a catch. The true driving force behind this anti-involution trend is likely not the Chinese government or any corporate conscience, but external pressures. For instance, the EU's mandatory labor regulations, which come into effect in January 2025, and the scrutiny faced by Chinese companies in the European market. Considered Jiǔcài, Midea, Hire, and Miniso, none of them lack a significant market share in Europe, particularly in the European market. Therefore, the KPI pressure on employees may not have eased at all. Mandatory early closure is merely a way to shift work from the office back to employees' homes, while superficially aligning with Western labor standards.